today's story is Sherlock, Mr. Croc. Let's go. Chapter 1. Mr. Croc was in the library. "I am looking for a book, Mrs. Reed," he said to the librarian. "Well, you've come to the right place, Mr. Croc," replied Mrs. Reed, smiling. "I've got thousands of books. Which one are you looking for?" Mr. Croc scratched his head. "I've forgotten," he said. Mr. Croc had a terrible memory, but I do know it was meant to be exciting. "Why don't you borrow a detective story, Mr. Croc?" suggested Mrs. Reed. She picked one out for him. "It's about the most famous detective in the world, Sherlock Holmes." Mr. Croc took the book home and started to read. He liked the book so much he read it while making supper, while washing up, and while brushing his 100 lovely teeth. The next day he went to see his best friend, Mr. Hound. "I've just read a wonderful book, Mr. Hound," said Mr. Croc. "Have you heard of Sherlock Holmes?" "Of course," said Mr. Hound. "He's the most famous detective in the world." "Not for long," replied Mr. Croc. "Someone else is going to be more famous soon." "Who?" asked Mr. Hound. "Me." Chapter 2. Mr. Croc went to the shops. He bought himself a coat, a hat, and a magnifying glass. "To be a famous detective, you have to look like one," he said. He walked proudly down the street. As he was passing the newsagent shop, he saw a sign: "Jewelry stolen. Diamond ring, silver badge, gold watch. Police baffled." "Aha!" cried Mr. Croc. "My first mystery! I will start by looking for clues." Mr. Croc walked on. Outside the jeweler's shop, he suddenly stopped. There, in a crack in the wall, something was glittering. "Aha! Maybe it's the lost diamond ring." Mr. Croc knelt down to peer through his magnifying glass. "No," he said, "it's just a bit of silver foil." Just then Mrs. Poodle came out of the shop. He tripped over Mr. Croc's big feet and landed right on top of Mr. Croc. Her new clock flew out of her hands and went spinning into the air. Down it came into Mr. Hound's arm. "Lucky I was passing." Mrs. Poodle picked herself up. "What on earth are you doing, Mr. Croc?" she said. "Sorry, Mrs. Poodle," replied Mr. Croc. "I was being a detective." "No, Mr. Croc," replied Mrs. Poodle crossly. "You were being a nonsense." Chapter 3. Mr. Croc went on his way. As as he and Mr. Hound were passing the park, he noticed something else. There was a glove in the hedge. "Aha!" said Mr. Croc. "Perhaps the thief left that behind. It could be a clue." Mr. Hound started to warn Mr. Croc, but it was too late. Mr. Croc grabbed the glove and pulled. Unfortunately, the glove belonged to Mr. Green, the park keeper, and his hand was still inside it. In a flash, Mr. Croc pulled Mr. Green halfway through the hedge. "What on earth are you doing, Mr. Croc?" spluttered Mr. Green. "Sorry, Mr. Green," said Mr. Croc. "It was being a detective." "No, Mr. Croc," replied Mr. Green crossly. "You were being a nonsense." Two magpies at the top of a nearby tree called out sharply, "Caw, caw, caw!" Lower down, a pail of squirrel made a chattering noise. It sounded as if they were all laughing at Mr. Croc. "My mystery solving isn't going very well. Perhaps it would be better if you put an advert in the paper," said Mr. Hound. "Then people could come to you." "What a good idea!" Mr. Croc rushed to the newspaper office and gave them an advert. "Mr. Croc's Detective Agency. Come to me if you've got a crime to solve. I will make your mystery history." Mr. Croc hurried home and waited for the phone to ring. He waited and waited and waited, but nobody wanted Mr. Croc to be a detective for them. Chapter 4. A few days later, the phone did ring, but it was only Mr. Hound. "Have you seen the posters, Mr. Croc?" "Which poster, Mr. Hound?" "The ones about the play," replied Mr. Hound. "A theatre group is putting on a play in the town hall. They are holding audition today. Are you going?" "I don't think so," said Mr. Croc. "Someone might need a detective." "What's the play called?" "Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of the Queen's Tiara," said Mr. Hound. "I am going," cried Mr. Croc, and rushed out of the door. At the town hall, Mr. Croc stood in line. It looked like everyone wanted to play the part of Sherlock Holmes. The director gave them all a few lines to learn. Mr. Croc smiled his lovely smile. "I am sure to get the part," he said to himself. "Not only do I have the nicest smile in the world, I am also a little detective." But when his turn came, Mr. Croc forgot his line, knocked over the scenery, and trod on the director's foot. "I don't think you're quite light for the part, Mr. Croc," said the director, hopping over to a chair. Mr. Croc turned to go. Just then the stage manager rushed in. "We've had a robbery!" she cried. "The Queen's tiara has vanished." "I was washing the tiara in the next room, and I left it by the open window to dry. I went away to fetch a cup of tea, and when I got back it was gone." "Oh no," said the director. "The mystery jewel thief was stuck again." Chapter 5. Mr. Croc, the director, and the stage manager hurried into the next room and stared at the empty windowsill. The director groaned. "What are we going to do now?" he said. "There's no time to order another tiara." "Oh dear," sighed the stage manager. "Sherlock Holmes and the mystery of the Queen's tiara has turned into a real-life mystery now." Mr. Croc smiled his lovely smile. "Don't worry," he said. "I am a detective. I will make your mystery history." The director and the stage manager shook their heads. "It's impossible, Mr. Croc," said the stage manager. "That like there are no clues." Suddenly, Mr. Croc bends down and picks something up. "Oh, but there are clues. There are." "Follow me," he cried, and rushed off. The director and the stage manager hurried after him, followed by the crowd outside. Chapter 6. Mr. Croc stopped at a large tree, and everyone gathered round. "What are you doing, Mr. Croc?" asked Mrs. Poodle. "Yes, what are you doing?" Mr. Croc smiled. "I am being a detective." Mr. Green looked at Mrs. Poodle. "Oh dear," he groaned. "Not again." But Mr. Croc turned to Mr. Gloss, the painter. "Can I borrow your ladder?" "Certainly, Mr. Croc." Mr. Croc propped the ladder against the tree. As he began to climb, a pail of chattering squirrel darted past him. At the same time, two magpies flew past, calling loudly. It didn't sound as if they were laughing at Mr. Croc this time. Instead, it sounded as if they were telling him to go away. "Go, go, go, go! Way, 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 way!" But Mr. Croc didn't go away. He kept on climbing. The crowd held its breath as Mr. Croc disappeared among the leaves. A few moments later, he appeared again and began to climb back down. As he stepped off the ladder, Mr. Croc smiled his lovely smile. He took a diamond ring, a silver badge, and a gold watch out of one pocket, and the Queen's tiara out of the other. The crowd cheered. "Hooray for Mr. Croc!" The magpies were the mystery thieves, explains Mr. Croc. They are attracted to bright, glittery things. If they spot something shiny, they pick it up when nobody's looking and take it back to their nest. Mr. Croc showed them what he had picked up at the town hall, 2 black and white feathers. But when they stole the tiara, they left these clues behind. The director and the stage manager were thrilled to get the tiara back. Thank you, Mr. Croc. The show is saved. Mrs. Poodle was delighted too. The ring was hers. She gave Mr. Croc a big kiss. Thank you, Mr. Croc, she said. I am sorry I called you a nonsense. So am I, said Mr. Green, as Mr. Croc returned his silver badge. You are brilliant at being a detective. Mr. Croc held up the watch. Who does this belong to? I think that's yours, Mr. Croc, said Mr. Hound. You reported missing last week. Mr. Croc blushed. So I did, he said. My goodness, what a dreadful memory I've got. Chapter 7. The next morning, there was a picture of Mr. Croc on the front page of the paper. Sherlock Mr. Croc solves mystery of Queen's tiara. A mystery surrounded the disappearance of 3 items. Well done, Mr. Croc, said Mr. Hound. You are a famous detective now. Our director was delighted too. What wonderful publicity, Mr. Croc, he cried. The play is sold out. He gave Mr. Croc 2 tickets. These are for the opening night. I'd like you to take a bow on stage. Will you? Of course, replied Mr. Croc, his eyes twinkling. After all, I am sure the audience would love to see the most famous and the second most famous detective in the world together on the same stage. Mr. Croc smiled his lovely smile, showing all of 100 shiny teeth.